She's a drain, Elena. A total drain on the family resources. Honestly, looking at her grades and that ridiculous little hobby of hers, I think it's time we call it what it is. The girl is worthless. She's a waste of the Wentworth name. Those words didn't come from a stranger. They didn't come from a schoolyard bully or some anonymous person on the internet. They came from my father-in-law, George, while he was cutting into a thick piece of medium-rare prime rib. He didn't even look up when he said it. He just kept chewing, his jaw working methodically, as if he had just commented on the weather or the price of gasoline. Beside him, my mother-in-law, Evelyn, didn't gasp. She didn't drop her fork. She just nodded subtly, reached for her wine glass, and took a delicate sip of a Chardonnay that cost more than my first car. My daughter, Chloe, was sitting right there. She's 16. At 16, your skin is thin. Every word from an adult feels like a brand on your soul. I watched the color drain from her face so fast I thought she might actually faint. Her hands, which were usually so steady when she held a charcoal pencil, started to shake. She looked at her plate, her long dark hair falling forward like a curtain to hide the tears I knew were coming. I looked at my husband, David. This was his father. This was his daughter. I waited for the explosion. I waited for him to stand up, knock his chair over, and tell his parents to get out of our house or tell them we were leaving theirs. But David didn't move. He just stared at his peas, his face turning a dull, dusty red. He looked small. In that moment, the man I had been married to for 18 years looked like a frightened little boy. "Dad, that's a bit harsh," David finally whispered. "Harsh?" George barked, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, like gray pebbles. "It's the truth. Look at Ryan's kids. Leo is captain of the varsity team and already has 3 Ivy League scouts watching him. Sarah is top of her class and just won the state debate. They are the ones we always praised, and for good reason. They're winners. But Chloe, she spends all day in her room drawing monsters. She's 16 and has no direction. She's a liability. We've spent enough on her tutors and her art supplies. It's time to stop throwing good money after bad. My name is Elena. I'm 37 years old, and until that very second, I thought I knew what my life was. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where we didn't have much, but we had respect. I worked 2 jobs to put myself through a state college, and when I met David, I thought I'd found a partner who valued the same things I did. We weren't rich like his parents, but we were comfortable, or so I thought. The Wentworths were old money. They lived in a world of high ceilings, manicured lawns, and a deep, soul-crushing sense of entitlement. They treated everyone like a chess piece, and it seemed my daughter had just been taken off the board. "She's not a liability, George," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. I felt a heat rising in my chest, a roar that was starting to drown out the sound of the grandfather clock ticking in the corner of their massive dining room. "She's a human being. She's your granddaughter." Evelyn set her glass down with a sharp clink. "Elena, don't be dramatic. We're talking about the future of this family. We provide for you. We provided the down payment on your house. We pay for the private school Chloe is currently failing to excel in. We have a right to voice our disappointment when the investment doesn't yield a return. Ryan's children are the prized children for a reason. They work hard. Chloe. Chloe just exists." Chloe stood up then. Her chair screeched against the hardwood floor. She didn't say a word, she didn't even look at me. She just turned and ran out of the room. I heard her footsteps thundering up the stairs, followed by the heavy thud of a door slamming shut. The room fell into a suffocating silence. "Now look what you've done," David groaned, finally looking at me, not at his parents. At me. "You had to make it a thing, Elena. They're just worried about her, you know how they are." "How they are?" I asked, leaning forward. "They just called our daughter worthless, David, to her face, and you sat there and let them do it. You're her father." "I'm a realist," George shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The silverware jumped. "She needs a wake-up call. If she doesn't change, she's going to end up as some starving artist living in your basement forever. We are cutting her off. No more tuition for that fancy academy. No more summer camps. If she wants to play around with crayons, she can do it on her own dime. We're focusing our resources on the children who actually have a future." This was the inciting betrayal. It wasn't just the words. It was the coordinated attack. I realized then that this hadn't been a spontaneous comment. They had discussed this. Evelyn and George had decided that my daughter wasn't Wentworth enough to deserve their support. And David had clearly been part of the conversation, or he was too weak to fight it. We left shortly after. The car ride home was a nightmare of silence. Chloe was in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. David was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. "Say something," I said, my voice cracking. "What do you want me to say?" David snapped. "They're right about the money, Alina. We can't afford that school without them. My job at the firm is tied to my dad's connections. If I piss him off, we lose everything. Why can't Chloe just try harder? Why can't she just be more like Sarah or Leo?" That was the second betrayal. My husband, the man who was supposed to be our protector, was choosing his parents' bank account over his daughter's spirit. He was looking at his own child through the lens of a balance sheet. When we got home, Chloe went straight to her room. I followed her, but the door was locked. I leaned my forehead against the wood. "Chloe, honey, please, they're wrong, you know they're wrong." "Are they?" Her voice came through the door, small and broken. "Dad didn't say they were wrong. He just said it was harsh. That means he thinks it's true. I'm just a waste of money to all of you." "Never to me," I whispered. "Never to me." I went downstairs to find David in the kitchen, pouring himself a stiff drink. He didn't look at me. He looked at the bottle of expensive Scotch George had given him for Christmas. "We're going to have to sell the house," David said coldly. I stopped dead in my tracks. "What?" "The mortgage is too high. My parents were subsidizing the payments as a gift. Since Chloe is being cut off, they're stopping the gifts too. They said if we want to support her lifestyle, we have to do it on my salary alone. We can't. We'll have to move to the other side of town, maybe a small apartment. Chloe will have to go to the local public school. It's over, Alina. Their patience is gone." This was the third betrayal. They weren't just attacking Chloe's future. They were dismantling our entire lives to punish her for not being a prized child. They were using our home as a weapon. And David was just rolling over, ready to pack the boxes. I spent that night on the sofa, staring at the ceiling. I felt a cold, hard knot forming in my stomach. I had always been the peacemaker. I had always tried to bridge the gap between my humble roots and the Wentworths' high society expectations. I had swallowed my pride 1,000 times when Evelyn made comments about my clothes or my cooking. I had stayed quiet when George ignored me at holiday dinners. But this was different. They had come for my child. As the sun began to peek through the blinds, I remembered something. It was a memory buried under years of busy motherhood and trying to fit in. I remembered my Aunt Martha. Martha wasn't a Wentworth. She was my mother's sister, a woman who lived in a tiny cottage on the coast of Maine and smelled like sea salt and peppermint. She had passed away when Chloe was just a baby. Martha had been a bit of an eccentric. She was an artist herself, though she never sold much. She used to tell me, "Alina, the world is full of people who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Don't let them turn you into a calculator." When she died, she didn't leave me much, just a small box of old journals and a heavy brass key. She had told me in her will that the key belonged to a rainy day. I had put it in the back of my jewelry box and forgotten about it. I had been so caught up in the Wentworth world of prestige and power that I had forgotten the quiet strength of my own bloodline. I stood up, my joints aching, and walked to the bedroom. David was snoring, oblivious to the war that was starting in my heart. I found the jewelry box, dug through the silver chains and pearl earrings Evelyn had gifted me, which I always felt were more like shackles, and found the brass key. Tied to the key was a small, faded tag with a phone number and a name, Arthur Sterling. I didn't know who Arthur Sterling was, but I knew I couldn't stay in this house another day feeling like a guest in my own life. I looked at the clock. It was 6 a.m. I went to Chloe's room and knocked softly. "Pack a bag," I said when she opened the door. Her eyes were red and swollen. "Where are we going?" she asked. "We're going to find out what you're really worth," I told her. "And I promise you, it's a lot more than what those people think." We left while David was still asleep. I didn't leave a note. I just took Chloe's hand and walked out to the car. As I drove away from the suburban neighborhood with its perfect lawns and its hidden cruelties, I felt a strange sense of lightness. I called the number on the tag. An older man answered on the third ring. His voice was deep and calm. "Sterling and Associates." "My name is Alina Miller," I said. "I have a key that belonged to Martha Thorne. She said to call this number on a rainy day." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the sound of papers rustling. "Ah yes, Mrs. Miller, I've been waiting quite a long time for this call. Martha was very specific. She said you'd know when the clouds got too dark. Where are you now?" "I'm in my car," I said. "With my daughter." "Good," Arthur Sterling said. "Drive to the First National Bank on 5th Street. I'll meet you in the lobby at 10. And Alina, Bring your daughter's birth certificate, you're going to need it. I hung up the phone, my heart racing. Chloe looked at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. Mom, who was that? What's going on? I don't know yet, honey, I said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. But I think your great-aunt Martha had one last trick up her sleeve. We spent the next few hours in a small diner, eating pancakes and watching the rain streak down the windows. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the pressure to be perfect. I didn't care if my hair was messy or if my sweater had a small snag. I just looked at Chloe. She was sketching on a paper napkin with a ballpoint pen, a bird with massive, powerful wings. She was beautiful, and she was talented, and the fact that anyone could call her worthless made my blood boil all over again. At 9:55 a.m., we pulled up to the bank. It was an imposing stone building, the kind that looked like it had been there for 100 years. Standing near the entrance was a man in a sharp gray suit with a shock of white hair. He looked like the kind of lawyer you see in movies, the one who knows where all the bodies are buried. Mr. Sterling, I asked as we approached. He smiled, and it was a genuine, warm smile. Call me Arthur. And this must be Chloe. He looked at my daughter with a keen, respectful gaze. You look just like her, you know. Martha had those same eyes, always looking at the world like she was trying to figure out how to paint it. Chloe blushed, a tiny spark of light returning to her eyes. You knew her? I was her attorney for 40 years, Arthur said. She was a remarkable woman. She didn't care much for the high society types. She preferred the company of dreamers. Now shall we go inside? We have some business to attend to, and I believe a certain bank manager is waiting for us. As we walked into the hushed, marble-floored lobby, I felt a surge of nervous energy. I didn't know what was behind that brass key, but I knew that whatever it was about to change everything. The Wentworths thought they could break us by taking away their money. They thought their wealth gave them the right to define our value. But they had forgotten one thing. My family had roots too, and some roots go much deeper than a bank account. The bank manager's office was tucked away behind a set of heavy oak doors. It felt like stepping back in time. There were no bright fluorescent lights here, just the warm glow of desk lamps and the smell of old paper and expensive leather. A nameplate on the desk read Mr. Harrison Vance, Regional Director. Mr. Vance was a man in his 50s with a very stiff collar and an even stiffer posture. He stood up when we entered, but his eyes weren't on me or Arthur. They were on Chloe. He looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and something that looked almost like awe. Mrs. Miller, he said, shaking my hand briefly. And Miss Chloe, it is an honor. Truly, I glanced at Arthur, who gave me a small, reassuring nod. We sat down in the plush velvet chairs. Chloe sat on the edge of hers, her sketchpad clutched to her chest like a shield. I'll get straight to the point, Arthur said, opening a leather briefcase and pulling out a thick file. Martha Thorne was a very private woman. She didn't believe in flaunting what she had. In fact, most of her family, including you, Alina, never knew the extent of her success. She spent her life quietly investing in emerging artists and buying up coastal real estate long before it became the gold mine it is today. I blinked. I thought she just lived on a small pension. She lived in that tiny cottage. She loved that cottage, Arthur chuckled. But she owned the 5 miles of coastline on either side of it. She sold those parcels to a nature conservatory 10 years before she passed. The proceeds were substantial. Mr. Vance cleared his throat and opened a ledger on his desk. Mrs. Miller, when Martha Thorne passed, she left specific instructions. She established a trust. It wasn't for you, though she made sure you would be taken care of if you ever reached out. The trust was specifically for Chloe. I felt the air leave my lungs. Chloe's mouth dropped open. For me, Martha saw the way your husband's family looked at the world, Arthur said, his voice turning serious. She saw the Wentworth way. She knew that eventually, they would try to squeeze the life out of you or your children. She wanted to ensure that if that ever happened, you had a way out. But she was very clear. The trust was to remain secret until Chloe's 16th birthday, or until a moment of extreme family crisis where Chloe's worth was called into question. Arthur looked at me. I assume something happened recently, I told him. I told him every word George had said. I told him about the worthless comment, the waste of resources, and the threat to take away our home. I told him how David had sat there and let it happen. As I spoke, Mr. Vance's face grew darker. He was a banker, but he clearly had a soul. I see, Vance said. Well, I believe the conditions have been met. Martha's instructions were that if the paternal family ever attempted to use financial leverage to diminish Chloe's spirit, the trust would be revealed in full. He turned the ledger around so we could see the final line. My eyes struggled to focus on the numbers. There were a lot of zeros, a lot. "This is the current balance of the Thorne Legacy Trust," Vance said. "It has been growing for 16 years, managed by some of the best hands in the business. As of this morning, Chloe, you are the sole beneficiary of $12 million. The room went silent. Not the suffocating silence of the Wentworth dining room, but a silence that felt like a physical weight. $12 million. It was a number so large it didn't even feel real. It was more than George and Evelyn's entire estate. It was more than David would earn in 3 lifetimes. Chloe started to cry. Not the quiet, shamed tears she had shed at the dinner table, but big, gasping sobs of relief. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tight. "There's more," Arthur said softly. "The trust isn't just cash. Martha left you her properties in Maine and a small gallery space in New York City. She wanted you to have a place to create, Chloe. A place where no one could ever tell you that your art is a hobby." I looked at my daughter. The worthless girl, the liability. She was now more powerful than the people who had tried to crush her. But as the shock began to wear off, a new feeling took over. It was a cold, sharp anger. "What happens now?" I asked. "The money is Chloe's," Arthur explained. "But since she is still a minor, you are the co-trustee, Alina. David has no legal claim to this money. Martha was very specific about that. The Thorne bloodline only. She saw David's weakness long ago. She knew he wouldn't stand up to his father." "I want to leave," I said. The words came out before I even thought them. "I can't go back to that house. I can't stay with a man who thinks our daughter is an investment that failed." "You don't have to," Arthur said. "I've already prepared the paperwork for a legal separation. We can secure a new place for you and Chloe today. And as for the Wentworths, I believe they have a family meeting scheduled for tonight to discuss your housing situation." I remembered. David had told me his parents were coming over at 7 p.m. to finalize the transition. They were coming to watch us pack. They were coming to savor their victory. "They're coming at 7, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. It wasn't a nice smile. "They think they're going to tell us how to live the rest of our lives." "Would you like some company for that meeting?" Arthur asked, his eyes twinkling with a bit of mischief. "I think Mr. Vance and I would very much like to attend. After all, as Chloe's legal and financial representatives, it's only right that we're present for any discussions regarding her future." The rest of the day was a blur of activity. We didn't go home. We went to a hotel, a nice one, and I watched Chloe sit by the window and draw. She wasn't drawing birds anymore. She was drawing a woman standing on a cliff, looking out at a stormy sea, her hair blowing in the wind. She looked strong. I called an old friend of mine, a woman named Maria who had worked for the Wentworths as a housekeeper years ago, before they fired her for asking for a weekend off to see her sick mother. She was my wronged ex-employee ally. Maria knew where all the skeletons were. She knew about George's offshore accounts and Evelyn's habit of borrowing from the family charity fund. "Alina," Maria asked when she picked up. "I haven't heard from you in years." "Maria, I need a favor," I said. "I need to know everything you remember about George's business trips to the islands, the ones he didn't tell David about." "Oh, honey," Maria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've been waiting for this call. I kept a log. I knew one day someone would want to know why the great George Wentworth was so worried about his privacy." By 6:30 p.m., I had everything I needed. I had the bank documents. I had the legal trust. And thanks to Maria, I had enough damning evidence of George's financial double-dealing to make his prized child, Ryan's inheritance, look like a joke. We drove back to the house at 6:50 p.m. David's car was in the driveway, along with George's silver Mercedes. I felt a pang of sadness as I looked at the front door. This was the home I had tried to build. This was the place where I thought I was happy. But it was a house built on sand, and the tide had finally come in. "Ready?" I asked Chloe. She took a deep breath. She had changed into her favorite outfit, a paint-splattered denim jacket and boots. She looked like herself. "Ready, Mom?" Arthur and Mr. Vance pulled up behind us in a sleek black sedan. They looked like the cavalry. We walked up the path together. I didn't use my key. I knocked. David opened the door looking stressed. "Alina, where have you been? My parents have been waiting for 20 minutes. We have a lot to talk about, and you just disappear with Chloe." He stopped when he saw the 2 men standing behind me. "Who are they?" "Legal counsel," I said, walking past him into the living room. George and Evelyn were sitting on our sofa like they owned it. George had a legal pad on his lap. Evelyn was looking at her nails. They both looked up with expressions of profound boredom that quickly turned to confusion. "Elena, what is this?" George demanded, standing up. "We're here for a private family matter." "Who are these people?" "This is Arthur Sterling, the executor of the Thorne estate," I said, my voice cold and clear. "And this is Harrison Vance, the regional director of First National Bank. They are here to discuss Chloe's future. Since you were so concerned about her worth last night, I thought it was only fair to bring in the experts." George scoffed. "The Thorne estate, your Aunt Martha, she was a peasant. What could she possibly have to do with anything?" Arthur stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "Mr. Wentworth, I would choose your next words very carefully. You are currently speaking about a woman whose net worth at the time of her passing was triple your own." The silence that followed was beautiful. George's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Evelyn's hand went to her throat, clutching her pearls. "Don't be ridiculous," David said, laughing nervously. "Aunt Martha lived in a shack." "She lived in a choice," Mr. Vance corrected, opening his briefcase. "She chose to live simply so that she could build a legacy for the only person in this family she felt had a soul. Chloe." He pulled out the trust documents and laid them on the coffee table. "As of today, Chloe Miller is the sole beneficiary of $12 million in liquid assets, plus real estate holdings valued at an additional $8 million. The trust is protected by ironclad clauses. It cannot be touched by any member of the Wentworth family. It cannot be used to pay off your debts, David. It cannot be used to fund Ryan's children's Ivy League dreams, George." The room seemed to shrink. George reached for the papers, his hands trembling. He scanned the numbers, his face turning from red to a ghostly, sickly white. $12 million, he whispered. "Actually, with the current market adjustment, it's closer to 13, Mr. Vance said with a sharp smile. Evelyn was the first to recover. She suddenly transformed. Her cold mask melted into a terrifyingly fake smile. She stood up and walked toward Chloe, her arms reaching out. "Oh, Chloe, darling, we always knew you were special. We were just trying to motivate you. We didn't mean those things, honey. We just wanted you to reach your full potential." Chloe stepped back, her expression one of pure disgust. "Don't. Just don't." "She's right," I said, stepping between them. "The motivation phase is over, and now we're moving into the consequences phase." I looked at David. He was staring at the floor, looking more pathetic than ever. He wasn't even looking at the money. He was looking at the realization that he had picked the wrong side. He had sold his soul for a pittance, and now he was watching the real treasure walk out the door. "Elena, honey, let's talk about this," David said, his voice shaking. "We're a family, we can fix this, we don't have to sell the house now, with Chloe's, I mean with our new situation." "There is no our situation, David," I said. "You sat there, you listened to them call her worthless. You told her she was a drain. You were ready to move her into a tiny apartment and take her away from her dreams because your daddy told you to. You didn't protect her. You didn't even try." "I was scared," he cried. "And she was 16, I snapped. She deserved a father who was braver than his bank account." I turned to George. He was looking at the papers again, his mind clearly racing to find a way to get his hands on the money. "And as for you, George," I said, pulling a manila envelope from my bag. "I spoke to Maria today. She was very helpful. It seems you've been a very busy man in the Caymans. I think the IRS would be very interested in the consulting fees you've been paying to a company that doesn't exist. Not to mention the way you've been skimming from the Wentworth Foundation to cover Ryan's gambling debts." George looked like he was having a heart attack. He collapsed back onto the sofa. "You wouldn't." "I would," I said, "in a heartbeat. Unless you sign these." I handed him a stack of papers Arthur had prepared. "These are documents stating that you and Evelyn will have no contact with Chloe until she is 18, at which point it will be her choice. You will also transfer the deed of this house to me, fully paid off, as a settlement for the years of emotional abuse you put me through. If you do that, Maria's log stays in my safe. If you don't, I make one phone call, and the Wentworth name becomes synonymous with federal prison." The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it could shatter. George looked at the papers, then at me, then at the lawyer. He realized he had no moves left. He was a bully who had finally met someone who wasn't afraid to hit back. He grabbed a pen and signed. His hand was shaking so much the signature was barely legible. Evelyn was sobbing now, real tears of terror as she saw her social standing evaporating. Now, I said, looking at the people who had tried to define our worth, get out of my house. They didn't argue. They didn't even look back. George and Evelyn scurried out the door like rats fleeing a sinking ship. David stayed, looking lost. Elena, he whispered. Go with them, David, I said softly. You belong with them, you always have. He looked at me, then at Chloe. Chloe didn't look at him. She was looking at the drawing on her lap, adding a few final touches to the woman on the cliff. David turned and walked out, closing the door behind him. The house was quiet. Arthur and Mr. Vance stood there, looking at us with professional pride. Well, Arthur said, I believe that concludes our business for the evening. Thank you, I said, and I meant it with everything I had. Both of you? Don't thank us, Mr. Vance said, tilting his head toward Chloe. Thank your Aunt Martha, she knew talent when she saw it. As they left, I sat down on the floor next to Chloe. We didn't say anything for a long time. We just sat in the quiet of our home, our real home now. Mom, Chloe eventually asked. Yeah, honey, do you think I'm worthless? I pulled her into my arms and held her so tight I could feel her heart beating against mine. Chloe, you are worth more than all the gold in the world. And from now on, no one, absolutely no one, is ever going to tell you otherwise. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was the one steering the ship. The house felt different. Without George's looming shadow or David's constant anxiety, the air seemed lighter. We repainted the walls. We got rid of the stiff, uncomfortable furniture the in-laws had suggested we buy. Chloe turned the formal dining room, the scene of her greatest humiliation, into her art studio. The long mahogany table was covered in canvases, jars of brushes, and tubes of vibrant oil paint. David had moved in with his parents. I heard through the grapevine, mostly from Maria, who still kept her ears to the ground, that it was a miserable arrangement. George was being investigated by the foundation's board, and Evelyn was busy trying to explain to her bridge club why they were no longer hosting the annual gala. Their world was shrinking, while ours was expanding in ways I could never have imagined. One afternoon, about a month after the bank reveal, Chloe and I were sitting on the back deck. She was working on a large piece, a portrait of her great-aunt Martha based on an old photograph Arthur had given us. Mom, Chloe said, not looking up from her work. I want to do something with the money. Something real. It's your money, honey, I said. What are you thinking? I want to start a scholarship, she said, finally putting her brush down. Her eyes were bright and focused. For kids like me. Kids whose families tell them that art is a waste of time. I want to call it the Thorn Legacy. We can use the gallery in New York to show their work. I don't want anyone else to feel the way I felt at that dinner table. I felt a lump in my throat. My 16-year-old daughter, the girl they called worthless, wanted to spend her fortune making sure other children felt valued. I think Martha would love that, I whispered. We spent the summer traveling. Not to the fancy resorts the Wentworths frequented, but to places Martha had loved. We went to the coast of Maine and stood on the cliffs she had owned. We breathed in the salt air and felt the power of the ocean. Chloe sketched constantly. Her work had changed. It was bolder now, more confident. She wasn't just drawing monsters or birds, she was drawing life in all its messy, beautiful complexity. One day, while we were in a small seaside town, I received a letter. It was from David. It was long, rambling, and full of apologies. He talked about how much he missed us, how he had finally realized his parents were toxic, and how he wanted to start over. I read it twice. 10 years ago, I would have cried. I would have felt guilty. I would have wondered if I was being too hard on him. But as I looked at my daughter, who was laughing with a local fisherman about the best way to paint a sunset, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just a profound sense of closure. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. David didn't love me. He loved the comfort his parents provided, and when that was gone, he tried to find it in me. But I wasn't a safety net anymore. I was a person. When we returned home for the start of the school year, we didn't go back to the private academy. Chloe enrolled in a specialized arts high school. On her first day, she walked through the doors with her head held high, her portfolio tucked under her arm. She wasn't the disappointment anymore. She was a girl with a future she had built for herself. The legal battle with George was short and sharp. Once Arthur presented the evidence of his financial irregularities, the Wentworths went quiet. They signed over the house and agreed to a substantial alimony settlement that I immediately diverted into Chloe's scholarship fund. I didn't want their money, I wanted their absence. A few months later, we held the first Thorn Legacy exhibition in the New York Gallery. The space was beautiful, white walls, high ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. We had selected 10 young artists from across the country, kids who had talent but no means to pursue it. The room was packed. Art critics, students, and curious passers-by filled the space. I stood in the corner, a glass of sparkling cider in my hand, watching Chloe. She was talking to a young boy, maybe 12 years old, who was staring at one of her paintings with wide eyes. "How did you make it look so real?" the boy asked. Chloe knelt down so she was eye level with him. "I didn't try to make it look real," she said. "I tried to make it look like how I felt. Don't let anyone tell you how your art should look, okay? Just tell your truth." I looked across the room and saw Arthur Sterling. He raised his glass to me and winked. He knew. He had seen this coming all those years ago when Martha sat in his office and planned her final act of rebellion. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests filtered out, Chloe came over to me. She looked tired but radiant. "We did it, Mom," she said, leaning her head on my shoulder. "You did it, Chloe," I corrected. We walked out onto the street. The city was alive with lights and sounds. For so long, I had been afraid of the world outside the Wentworth bubble. I had been afraid that we weren't enough. But standing there with my daughter, I realized that value isn't something that's given to you by people in expensive suits. It's not something that's calculated in a ledger. Value is the courage to stand up when everyone tells you to sit down. It's the strength to keep creating when the world tells you it's a waste of time. And it's the love of a mother who refuses to let her child be defined by someone else's narrow mind. I'm 37 years old. My name is Alina, and I finally know what I'm worth. If you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, or like the people who should love you the most are the ones holding you back, I want you to remember Chloe. I want you to remember that your worthless hobby might just be your greatest strength. Don't let the calculators of the world tell you who you are. Find your own brass key, find your own truth, and when the rain starts to fall, don't hide, just keep drawing. Because sometimes, the people who call you worthless are just terrified of how much you're actually worth. Thank you for listening to my story. If this touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and emotional triumphs. Your support means everything to us. See you in the next story.